Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to something that's a little bit new. Today we're going to be looking at a pair of truly interesting but obscure and very French aircraft. Now this is not a normal overview video like we've seen on the channel before, because with these particularly obscure French aircraft there isn't a lot of verified source information for me to go off, outside of printed French magazines from the 1920s and the 1930s. There's very little contemporary stuff written on them. However, it gives me a really good excuse to trial out a new video format. Unfortunately, I also feel like my hand has sort of been forced in this whole matter as well, and doing this new format, which involves me being on camera a bit more, because I apparently now need to prove to the YouTube algorithm that I'm a human being, because there has been a monumental flood of AI slop and low-effort content coming onto the platform over the past 12 to 18 months, which many of you have noticed, and I've seen a lot of very kind comments on my videos saying how you appreciate how well researched the videos are and how there is actually a person narrating it and not some sort of strange, distorted, fake voice that attempts to put on some sort of accent. The AI issue is becoming quite serious at this point in terms of YouTube as a video platform for those of us in the history and other educational niches, because there is a lot of low effort and very factually incorrect videos that are getting uploaded on a daily basis. Some are 2 minutes long, but others are a lot longer, like, 20, 30 minutes long, and half of it is all just crap. It's all just been spewed out by ChatGPT and whatever bloody LLM they're using, drawing on God knows what sort of bogus sources there are. The main issue is so many of these AI models are basically learning just from scraping data online, and if you're anyone who's frequented various aviation forums and websites, you'll know that a lot of them have got conflicting information, and I guess for me in a good way that's good, because it means that these LLMs and ChatGPTs and everything don't honestly produce good research scripts, which, kind of keeps me in the job at least. But it has also affected the niche in the sense that it's affected how YouTube is promoting content to new audiences, because you've got so many of these sort of history videos that are not performing well because people are realizing within 30 or 60 seconds of the video running that it's AI shit. That tanks that video's stats, but it also then tanks the topic as well. And so things like aviation, nautical history, that sort of thing, there's been a lot of up and down over the past 6 to 12 months as channels have had to deal with the fact that they are now having to convince the algorithm that their content is good, whilst at the same time there are lots of people inputting into the algorithm stuff that is rubbish, and at the exact same time as all of this is going on, we've got other random tweaks that are being made behind the scenes by the people at YouTube as well. It's not even the fact that like half of these videos are using factually incorrect information. Some of them are straight up stealing my content and the content produced by other creators on the platform as well. I've seen videos that I produced literally downloaded and then re-uploaded with some tweaks and then put on a channel. I've had thumbnails stolen, I've had thumbnails reproduced, the list goes on. The amount of takedown requests I've had to put in over the past 12 months has been absolutely insane. So it is a problem, and it is one of the main reasons why I'm trying this new format to prove that, yes, I am a human being, actually in here working, researching, poring over books. And this is just a small sliver of the entire collection that I have, and I'm actually putting in work and research and doing what I love, because even though I've been on the platform for a relatively shortish period of time, like 4 years, this has been my passion for my entire life, and I love sharing it with people. And I don't like the fact that generative AI systems are threatening that, so I'm going to do everything in my power basically to make sure that I am algorithmically relevant, although at the same time I'm trying to not make it too much of a cop-out. Anyway, that's my tangent over, that is why I'm doing this video format. Now, is this going to have an impact on the videos that I'm going to be producing moving forward? In terms of the video formats that are already on the channel, absolutely not. The normal videos are going to be staying. I'm still going to be doing aircraft overviews, and I'm still going to be doing deep dives. I am restricting my overviews to being roughly no more than 15 minutes long unless absolutely necessary, because I feel like we're kind of blurring the lines between my short videos and my longer videos, and I want there to be a clear-cut difference. this also makes it easier from a production standpoint and actually trying to build a video backlog again, so that I'm not just putting out just a couple of videos a month. I actually want to go back to a decent video schedule. And that's a lot easier to do if you make a bunch of shorter videos and then work on the longer ones whilst they're up and going. So this is a me fix as well as getting stuff out there for you as well. I'm also going to be planning some videos on aeronautical engineering topics, like things like the development of airship technology, which the patrons voted on. I'm going to be doing stuff on the development of air screws, landing gear, that sort of thing as well. So that is in the works as well. So that sort of video format is staying. This is just going to be an additional thing on top of it. Along with that, some other video formats that I've tested are also going to be making a return, such as the podcast style videos. I did one trial already with my mate Jim, and we're also going to try and find a way to sort of work that into a couple of live overview videos as well, where me and some other people sort of do a live presented overview of a particular aircraft, sort of keep it to 15-20 minutes, and that way you can also hear the opinions of some of my peers who I esteem, as I am not always a complete expert on a particular plane, funnily enough. One other thing I really want to get back into doing, and I know I said I was going to be doing this frequently, and it's completely buggered up already, was the idea of doing live streams. Hopefully that is actually going to be a thing that's happening. Unfortunately, even though I've already said this twice, now that I'm settled in this place that I'm living in now, there's a non-0% chance I need to move house again before Christmas, so we're gonna play that one by ear as well for the time being. So if there are going to be live streams, they're probably going to be fairly last minute and more of a sort of fun discussion sort of live stream, as opposed to anything mega serious planned until we get into the new year and I can actually sit down, bang my head against the desk repeatedly for 10 days and plan out several months worth of stuff. A lot of all of this as well, these new sort of bonus topics, are going to be referencing a lot of my materials in my collection, because the overview and the deep dive videos make use of a lot of my book material, but there are things that I found in there, little tidbits of history and interesting facts that, you know, I really want to share, but they don't usually make for a good individual video, either because they're too weird, or the amount of information is too small. It's too, like, it isn't enough for a video, and I don't want to do YouTube shorts. So I'm thinking, you know, I'll combine a few of these into one specific video, and, you know, it can be a video of, you know, weird particular planes developed by this particular branch of this particular nation or something like that, you know. So I'm going to be referencing a lot of my old vintage magazines. I've got Flying Review, I've got Flight Magazine, I've got a bunch of French, German and Italian magazines, and I'm even building up a collection of Japanese magazines, particularly the ones printed by the University of Tokyo, including ones from the Second World War. I've got one that actually documented the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, literally printed in 1942. I need to get that out of its plastic bag at one point. But anyway, yes, so moving forward, new videos, new video formats, and we're going to be making use of my book collection as much as possible so that I can actually start getting a return on my investment, as over the past 10 plus years I have spent an unfathomable amount of money on my books, which I love, but, you know, still got to pay a mortgage and bills and all that kind of stuff, so yes. Now, speaking of books, I have a recommendation for you today, and those who know me know that I'm pretty picky when it comes to handing out book recommendations, but I was blown away by the quality of this one. Now, funnily enough, I don't always want to read dry textbooks and technical reports. Sometimes I need a palate cleanser after a long day of research, something that's both stimulating and entertaining, and this thing does both brilliantly. This is the book, and it is The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. It's a brilliant concept. It's a visual guide that offers you a fascinating journey through the most significant inventions in human history. It contains a wealth of information. It's over 400 pages long, covers over 180 different topics across 23 chapters. It's, of course, not a complete step-by-step guide to restoring the world, but it does give you a general understanding of everything that would be required to do so, and it does this beautifully. From start to finish, this thing is drop-dead gorgeous. You're greeted by a beautiful blue and silver bookbinding, and inside there are hundreds of handmade illustrations. These explain everything from how to make simple tools to medicine, winemaking, building techniques, industrial and scientific concepts, and many other things that we take for granted in everyday life. Not only are the illustrations highly detailed and beautiful, but quite a few of them also contain hidden pop culture references, and the book itself contains a secret puzzle for readers to discover, which adds an extra layer of intrigue and interactivity. This book has been a labour of love for the authors. Over 1.2 million hours went into producing it, and it shows. Every page is unique. The matte paper is of excellent quality, and the printing of the text and the illustrations is immaculate. And it's nice and big. The perfect sort of coffee table book, or possibly a defensive melee weapon in the event of the apocalypse actually happening. The book is the perfect gift to give to someone who is curiously minded, or someone who wants to expand their book collection with something interesting, and I'm incredibly glad that it is now part of mine. So, to grab your own copy of this unique and beautiful book, click on the link in the description below and use the code REX'sHangar10, or scan the QR code on the screen, and you will get 10% off your purchase. Alright, with that cheeky little segue aside, let's look at these weird French planes and completely not pay attention to the fact that that sponsor segment was recorded approximately 2 weeks ago. So, the first one I want to talk about in this video today is one called the Bascalet de Monge twin boom design. And honestly, out of the two, in some ways, I find this to be the more outlandish. So, it does look something not akin to a bread box that sprouted wings with a fixed undercarriage, but it's actually a remarkably interesting design. These were designed by Belgian pioneer Louis de Monge, and I apologise if I pronounced his name incorrectly, and these were built in France in the mid-1920s. These are twin-boom, twin-engine, experimental lifting body monoplanes, so the lift isn't just coming from the wings, it's coming from the essentially the body, or the fuselage if you would call it that, but it isn't really a fuselage now because it's been smushed. Several examples of these were built. You had the Model 7-3, the Model 7-4, and the Model 7-5. These are not full-scale designs. These were all built as scaled, aerodynamic, piloted test beds for a proposed larger tri-motor transport, which would be known as the de Monge Model 7-2, which was supposed to carry approximately 20-ish passengers. So these were not full-scale aircraft, but they were still flyable by a pilot. Now, of these, the 7-4 and the 7-5 have the most documentation written on them, but the 7-3 has the best photographic record. And as you can see, as I'll be showing on the screen here, the difference in photo quality is incredibly stark. That is because, very happily, high-resolution photos of the 7-3 can be found on a French website called Gallica. Gallica is basically the digital library of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, or BNF, and its partners. And since 1997, it's basically provided free and open access to several million digitized documents, books, newspapers, curios, what have you, from all periods and media within France, and I was able to find some wonderful photos of the de Monge twin boom in there. Unfortunately, all of the photos on there are of the 7-3, so I might be referencing images of the 7-3 when I'm talking about the -4 or the -5, just for the sake of image clarity and quality. So the reason I wanted to bring up this design, even though they're technically just a flying scale prototype, was because these were among the first successful examples of what we now know as a blended wing design. Even today, the concept is still being developed and is still considered, fairly experimental. And back in the 1920s, it was completely in its infancy. For context, there's only a couple of other designs that really properly either got off the drawing board or barely even got off the ground in the first place during that decade. You had, in 1924, the Westland Dreadnought, which was a design from the early to mid-1920s, which made its maiden flight in 1924, which was also its last maiden flight. So that kind of shows how good that one was. And then fast forward the clock about 10 years, you have the more famous Bonelli UB-14, which was developed in the early 1930s. A couple examples, well, not exact examples, but sort of a derivative of it was then built under license as well. Only one of the original Benelli UB-14s was ever built. But aside from those, the Monge design is one of the few other examples that were drawn up, built, albeit to scale, and then flown successfully. So a quick breakdown on the aircraft itself. Now sources do differ, but all three prototypes were built between roughly 1923 to 1925-ish. The 7-3 and the 7-4 were very similar in appearance, and the 7-5 was built a little bit later and appears to have had some modifications based off lessons learned from possibly building as well as flying the earlier two. The most noticeable difference between the 7-3 and the 7-4 to the 7-5 was the wingtips. So the earlier two had squared off wingtips, the final one did not. The 7-5 also had a bit more of a sweep back on its leading edge as opposed to the 7-3 and the 7-4. But aside from that, all of them were broadly similar in design. All of them had twin booms that were extending rearward from the wing's thickened center section to carry the tail. Now, the thick center section of the wing was unusually deep in chord and thick to house the pilots, and then in the planned full-scale flying trimotor, the fuel and the avionics systems. In these scale models, it is interesting to note that the engines were mounted close to the wing center section. So close that in the 7-3 and the 7-4, the propeller discs actually overlapped, and thus the propellers and the engines had to be canted so that they obviously didn't, smash into each other and cause a lot of mess. In the 7-5, the engines were spaced apart a little bit further, and this didn't have to be done. Now, unlike the next aircraft I'll discuss in this video, and slight spoiler alert, a lot of care and prior research was put into the design of these flying prototypes. They were designed to be rapidly assembled and disassembled, and this is something that is praised in several French magazines at the time. The outer wing spars were connected to the central section by pairs of adjustable ball joints, and this is shown in a 1925 edition of the French aviation magazine L'Aeronautique. They've actually got some wonderful sort of illustrations that show how this sort of all connected up together. Now, in terms of airframe dimensions, the three are broadly similar again. The 7-3 had a wingspan of 10.7 meters, and the 7-4 and the -5 had a wingspan of 11.5 meters. They had lengths of between 5.3 to 6.2 meters, and they were all approximately 1.65 to 1.69 meters in height. Total weight for the 7-3 was 650 kilos, 750 for the 7-4, and for the 7-5 it was a bit lighter at 680. Power plant is disputed for two of these because I have sources that conflict in various magazines, so take this with a grain of salt. But the 7-3 had a 35 horsepower 3-cylinder Anzani radial engine. The two of them, obviously. The 7-4 used 35 horsepower Vaseline inline engines, and the 7-5 used 45 horsepower 4-cylinder Bugatti engines. This last one is the one where there seems to be a bit of conflicting information depending on what book and source you look at for this. All three of these were documented to have flown successfully, although exact dates are unknown, and despite their very unconventional appearance, all three aircraft were structurally sound, they were stable in flight, and they performed reliably. The most surprising thing about the design, although it was not wholly unexpected, was how efficient it was. Now, even though these were just scaled-down prototypes, at least one of them was entered into efficiency and economy competitions due to their low power and remarkably clean aerodynamics. The advantage of the blended wing design is, of course, it produced more lift for the general airframe itself, and so, if you're getting more lift, you can do with less engine power, and obviously with less powerful engines, you're saving a bit of fuel, providing the engine's efficient, it kind of just goes on and on like that. There isn't much known about the details of how well they performed in these competitions because, again, the magazines that sort of covered this at the time all have slightly conflicting information. But it is known that at least the 7-3 model took part in an event in 1925 where it performed remarkably well, although it did have a false start at the beginning of the race. Aside from this though, not much is known about how they were used. One was supposedly readily convertible to be made into an ambulance, which could either carry a patient and a nurse or two patients, but whether it was ever used in that capacity or whether that was just used as sort of a sales pitch to try and save the design, it's impossible to say. Unfortunately, the design was not saved and it never proceeded beyond these sort of scale models because the company hit financial difficulties, and there were also some technical details in scaling it from the sort of 1/3 to 1/2 scale into the full design that presented a lot of logistical and financial challenges. Now, in passing, I should say these were not the only strange aircraft that were designed by de Monge. He came up with some very weird and wonderful experimental aircraft over these interwar years, and I've only found out about most of them thanks to these French magazines that I've started collecting. So hopefully once I've got enough of these sort of stacked away in my wardrobe over there, I will do a much longer video on de Monge and his interesting designs, because some of them are truly fascinating. But now we're going to move on to the other aircraft that I want to talk about in this video. And while the de Monge models were technically successful, this one was not. Now feast your eyes on this thing. Ho, it's very French. No, this is the Besson H-5, which was a quad-engined quadruplane flying boat commercial airliner, which is not something that you hear very often. From the front, it sort of reminds me of the Supermarine Nighthawk, the sort of failed Zeppelin hunter from, I think, 1917 or 1918. And in other ways, it sort of reminds me of the Caproni Novaplano, which had, it was a triple triplane. All three of these designs are utterly hideous and terrifying at the same time. But looking at the Besson from the side, we see something very different and something that is incredibly unique and something that I've struggled to find in another design of this scale or ambition. It's a quadruplane, but the wings are staggered in two pairs, and then they're connected with these sort of interesting X-shaped struts. If you look at the lowest wing, you can see the strut to the far right technically runs all the way through up to the third wing, and then it sort of goes out again all the way up to the top. It's a very interesting layout. By far and away, it's probably one of the most interesting flying boats from the interwar period that I've come across, and I first discovered this in a Flight magazine article ages ago, and I bookmarked it because I have, on all of my magazines that I have, like this one for example, if I find something really weird or interesting, I just put a little sort of paper tag on them. And so I've been going over these paper tags, and I have them color-coded per nation as well. And yeah, this thing came up and I'm like, okay, I need to talk about this. It is possibly one of the most French things I have seen when it comes to interwar aviation. And I know I like to bash the French a lot in this on this when it comes to interwar aviation, but it comes from a place of love, because I love that they were so ambitious and so happy to think outside the box and go for different designs during this period when pretty much everyone was learning as they go anyway, and so the French just went hard and they just went, a lot of the designs didn't work, but they were very brave, and, you're not going to forget a design like that when you see it. It might not necessarily be the most attractive design you've ever seen in your life, but it's definitely going to stick. So why was this quad-engined quadruplane flying boat that looks a little bit guppy even built in the first place? Well, it was built by an ambitious man by the name of Marcel Besson. He was born in 1889, apparently, in France, and he's one of France's lesser-known aeronautical engineers who had a focus on seaplanes and flying boats. He also joined in on the trend of French aviating pioneers of having their first flying aircraft being of an early canard design, like those of Voisin, for example. So his first aircraft was a canard. I'll put it on the screen here for you to see. Most of his designs were unconventional in nature and highly experimental. Some were successful, some were not. But by far and away the most unconventional of all of them, and the most ambitious, was the Besson H-5. So why was this very interesting flying boat ever built? Well, sources conflict on this. According to Flight Magazine, it began life as a design for the French Navy as a long-range maritime patrol aircraft. However, French magazines, and these are the ones I'm more likely to believe in this case, say that that actually referred to a different design that was being drawn up by Marcel Besson that was eventually abandoned, and this one began life as a design for a commercial aircraft. It was to be completed as a 20-passenger transport flying boat. Again, though, this is confirmed by some magazines and not confirmed by others, and as far as I'm aware, I've not found a proper sourced textbook about designs by Marcel Besson that include anything in any detail regarding to the H-5, so just take all of this with a metric crap ton of salt. But anyway, so it was either going to be a maritime patrol flying boat or it was going to be a passenger transport. Either way, it was completed to be a passenger transport with a 20-passenger capacity. Right, onto the design itself. Why a quadruplane? Well, the main reason was, honestly, lifting capability and size and the requirements to operate on water. Owing to the fact that it wasn't going to be powered by the most powerful engines, early estimates gave a required wing area of approximately nearly 2,800 square feet, which is quite a lot of wing for this time. At this scale, a monoplane was completely out of the question, and even with biplane wings of this time, it would result in a very large wingspan, and when you're on a flying boat, even with pontoons sort of supporting the wings when you're on the water, that would produce a very wide wingspan indeed, which would obviously, present challenges in keeping it stable and keeping the wings in one piece, because obviously if it lands hard, or if it's being operated in even vaguely grumpy water, there is a serious risk of the wings being damaged, particularly if you've got a biplane design with struts, the compressive forces and everything. It's just, yeah, bit too much with a really wide wingspan, and so they went for a quadruplane as a way to get around this, because you can halve the wingspan, again, going from monoplane to biplane to quadruplane. Of course, you do make a sacrifice in height and drag in other ways, and this also affects pitch stability if you don't get this bang on, because obviously if you're flying with a lot of wing there, you need to make sure that everything is set up perfectly, otherwise that acts with a lot of leverage and messy. In case you haven't picked up on this yet, I'm not actually a qualified aeronautical engineer, so some of the more complex nuances of quadruplane design do escape me, although I have been reading a lot on aeronautical engineering over the past 2 years, so I know a lot more than when I first started doing this. My passion for aviation started with just the how and the why and the human story, and finding out why planes like this were even designed in the first place. Anyway, I digress. So yes, Marcel Besson settled on a quadruplane design on account of the whole wingspan and flexing wings on water issue, and this design was drawn up incredibly quickly in the span of just a few months, and a model was exhibited at the 1921 Paris Air Show, where it got a lot of attention for its unusual 4-engine and 4-wing configuration. At the time, it was reported on by Flight Magazine, who expressed doubts as to the aeronautical feasibility of this design, as to how well it would actually fly. As it turned on, they were somewhat on the money, although at the time, I think their pessimism was a little bit harsh, considering other aircraft like the Supermarine Nighthawk, which was also a quadruplane, had been flown successfully. Of course, there were other quadruplanes flown, but just not of that size and immensity, So when it was completed, it was built in Boulogne-sur-Seine, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, and it was then transported to San Rafael, which was on the Mediterranean coast. There it would be reassembled and flight tested. Completed, the Besson H-5 had a wingspan of 21.5 meters, a length of 7 meters, and an empty weight of 7,200 kilos. A point to note here is it came in very overweight. It was estimated originally, when Besson dropped the design, he was predicting a maximum empty weight of 4,800 to 5,000 kilos. So it was just over 2 tons heavier empty than it was planned to be. With engines of this time, you can probably see where this is going. Indeed, the engines caused delays from the outset because flight testing was delayed by almost 6 months due to issues with weight balancing, the engine starters not wanting to, well, start the engines, and then also issues to do with the engines overheating, particularly the rear engine, because it was in a push-pull configuration in 2 nacelles. There were also supposedly issues with the upper main plane and the struts, although that has only been noted in one magazine, so I don't necessarily want to commit too hard on that particular fact. Eventually, flight testing did get underway, but unlike the Monge twin-boom aircraft that I talked about just before, this one did not enjoy anywhere near something that could be called success. It's bad, okay? So the first takeoff happened on the 8th of September 1922, and it was piloted by somebody from the French Navy, Lieutenant Maurice Hurel, because basically they couldn't find a civilian test pilot with stones large enough to fly this thing from a lake. And so the French Navy basically stepped in, went to Maurice and said, "You fly it." And he basically had no choice. He probably did have a choice, but he was strongly advised to test fly it. Unfortunately, the first test flight was a bit of a farce because, as it turned out, the aircraft was very poorly balanced to the point where it took off a lot more easily than anticipated because all its nose wanted to do was this, and just go straight up. This then led to a problem when it came to landing, because very quickly the test pilots realized that the aircraft was nigh on uncontrollable and attempted to bring it in for a landing. When you're fighting a nose wanting to go up and you're trying to bring it down, unless you're incredibly good with the controls, landing that on the water is going to be a precarious situation. A lot of people thought this was going to be a case of a tail strike, because obviously if you're trying to fight an upward attitude pitch, that's the most likely scenario. As it turned out, the pilot overcorrected at the last moment trying to fight this nose up, and essentially the front of the flying boat just slammed down onto the water, and it immediately buckled the hull, ripping off a 1.5 meter square section and began flooding uncontrollably. And the only way that they saved the entire thing was by beaching it. So that's a great first flight. So in this, the biggest thing that had actually come into play was the weight. The engines could actually manage, even though it came in nearly 2 tons overweight, but it was overweight and also the weight was not evenly distributed. This required them adding another 850 kilograms of weight onto the aircraft just to balance the nose, so now it's nearly 3 tons overweight. And a 3-ton overweight aircraft with a combined engine power of just shy of 1,000 horsepower, because the Samsung engines were only 260 horsepower at most, it's going to start having performance issues, and funnily enough, that is what happened when test flying resumed. It didn't fly again until 1923, owing to repairs and various modifications. The successive fixes, which included the added ballast, reinforcing the hull, and redesigning the tail, only worsened the weight problem that I just mentioned, and it was at to the point when it was almost 4 tons overweight that it was cleared to fly again. It was of course now so heavy that it barely made it off the water, and many argue that a lot of the flights in this configuration were more the result of ground effect rather than it actually flying successfully, because for several test flights in 1923, it never climbed above 30 or 35 meters. One of the worst cases of this was in April, where it had a test flight of all of 27 seconds because of an adjustment in trim and ballast again. The control column was so stiff and difficult for the pilots to maintain in a steady trim that he felt that his arms would become fatigued too soon, and so he abandoned takeoff. Finally, later on in May, after more tweaks, which added a smidge more weight again, it finally conducted a longer flight. The Besson H-5 completed its one and only flight of greater than 10 minutes. It flew for an hour this time, only after extreme perseverance by the pilot, and it only reached a maximum altitude of 900 meters. It could probably climb higher than that, but the pilot didn't want to, and he had concerns about the engines overheating, and so he wanted to be relatively close to a place where he could safely land quickly. Then landing, the same thing happened again as what happened earlier on. It came down a bit hard, the hull got damaged, and it ripped off another 1 meter square section of plating, and a bit of other stuff came out, and it began flooding again, and for the second time they had to beach the Besson H-5 to prevent it sinking. Once repaired again, flight testing then resumed in July, but only one more successful test flight was made. Following that, during another takeoff, not landing this time, the hull failed once again, but this time it did so a little bit more spectacularly, and although a smaller section of hull came off, it took part of the internal hull framing with it, which really isn't good. Structurally compromised and sinking again, it was beached for a third time, and at this point, the French authorities finally decided enough was enough, and they stepped in and they terminated testing. Why they waited this long, I honestly don't know, but clearly they were hoping that this design that they'd invested in would get to the point where it was actually usable, but alas, this was never the case. After this testing was cancelled, it was then stored outside for the rest of 1923, while Besson tried to find a way to either fix it or convince someone else to take it off his hands. Nature solved the problem for him by wrecking it in a storm in December. There was a fairly severe storm in the region. This not only tore the tail clean off from the hull, basically snapping it off, but it also caused the whole airframe to essentially get tussled in the wind, and this caused enough buckling of the framework in the hull that the whole thing was essentially written off. Now, if you want an idea of how bad this machine was, it's a good idea to read the final test flight report that was done by CEPA, which was the French Commission for Applied Research in Aviation. At the time, this is the body that essentially evaluated all aircraft, be it civil or military. You had to go through their testing for it to, obviously become certified and then enter production. I'm just going to read what some of the report says. Now, this is translated from French into English, and there might be a few errors here, so I apologize in advance. I'm just going to take snippets out of it. The 4-engine commercial seaplane designed by Besson, with a power plant producing a total of 1,000 horsepower, was, unfortunately, built without much serious preliminary research. In particular, it is difficult to accept as a norm that a designer can err in weight calculations to such an extent as Mr. Besson did, 7,200 kilograms instead of 4,500 kilograms, having created a very flimsy design. The aircraft was submitted for testing with problems with centering, and only thanks to the exceptional airmanship and presence of mind of the test pilot was it possible to avoid destruction of the aircraft several times. The shape of the hull made the aircraft unsuitable for any service at sea, and on the other hand, it is extremely unlikely that it would have been able to take off with a hull of any different shape either. The commercial efficiency of this aircraft thus seems insignificant. Reading between the lines, that is the French way of basically saying that Besson was incompetent in designing this machine, which, if you look at it on the face of things, is sort of on the money. But again, though, playing devil's advocate, no one had really built flying boats of this size and scale before. Hull form design back then for flying boats is still incredibly experimental, and as many failed as they did succeed. Hilariously, though, despite being a colossal failure in terms of a design, the Besson H-5 was actually profitable. Because the aircraft was ordered under a French ministry contract, development, construction, transportation, and even some of the modifications were paid for by the French government and not out of the pocket of Besson and his company. Once the prototype was built, handed over and flight tested, and this just includes the initial test flights, Besson's company had technically fulfilled the initial terms of their contract, even if the design itself had failed to produce a successful aircraft. And so, you have a successful scale model that should have made its way to a full-scale design, and you had a full-size design that should never have made it beyond the stage of a scale model. If that isn't French early interwar aviation in a nutshell, I honestly don't know what else it is. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members whose help keeps the channel going. And of course, a special thank you to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. Hopefully you enjoyed this slightly different and new video format. If you'd like to see more, let me know, and I do apologise if my narration was a bit rambly. I am pretty much doing that one off script today, and I only had a couple of sort of PowerPoint slides in front of my face just to make sure that I actually roughly stayed on track with this. If you've got any other questions, feel free to leave them in the pinned comment below as always, and if you're new here or just stumbled onto this video, I encourage you to take a look through the channel's back catalogue, as there are plenty of more other aviation videos to look at. And of course, if you enjoy what you see and you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel to appease the ever recalcitrant gods of the YouTube algorithm. But that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.